Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I want to thank the Buckley program as well for inviting me here. This is great. So what I want to talk today about are, as you can see, conservative solutions to water shortages in the Colorado River Basin. After about 4 years of working and studying in public water distribution in the West, as I worked, I began to find that a lot of the solutions that were working well in the West for providing water for people there struck me as conservative, but they weren't necessarily being called that. So some of the ideas I'm going to talk about today are ideas that have been implemented, other ideas that have not been implemented, but all of them I believe to be conservative, and I want to defend them as such. I want to start out by sharing an anecdote from my hometown of Logan, Utah. In 1991, the Utah State Legislature allocated 220,000 acre-feet of water, which is a lot of water, to 4 separate municipalities in northern Utah. 2 of these municipalities were close to the river, and 2 of them were a little farther away. And the ones that were farther away were larger, and they got less water. And the 2 that were closer got more water. This is what the lawyers like to call getting first dibs. But you also notice between these 4 municipalities, the bottom one, which is where I lived, Cache County, does not have what you see as a water conservancy district. And as time went on, locals of Cache County began to notice that these other 3 districts had a lot more political power in Salt Lake City than they did, because they did not have a water conservancy district. So in 2016, in the 2016 election, while the rest of America was voting for President Trump, Cache County, we were voting for a water conservancy district, and we got it. And that has benefited our county greatly in providing, in securing this allocation of the Bear River and other water allocations that the state legislature and other entities have promised us. So I want to back out now and talk about the entire Colorado River Basin and show how similar principles have helped people in the Colorado River Basin. So that actually should say it supplies water to 40 million people. And the reality is that the Colorado River is arguably the most important river in the country economically. It's certainly the most regulated river. However, there are shortages there, and there's serious shortages there. The Bureau of Reclamation, which is the federal agency that protects water in the West, predicts a 57% chance of water shortages by 2020, and that percentage only goes up as time goes on. The reservoirs there are plunging as well. The 2 main reservoirs in the Colorado River Basin are Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Lake Mead is held by Hoover Dam, and Lake Powell held by the Glen Canyon Dam. And as those reservoir levels go down, the states of particularly Arizona and Nevada are at risk of having their water supply cut off, because the water that comes from 3 states away is not there. However, not all states are suffering equally in the Colorado River Basin. I mentioned Utah, my home state, has largely managed to evade itself from this water crisis. And I want to share some of the reasons why I believe that has happened. In 1956, the Utah State Legislature created the Central Utah Project. The federal government created the Central Utah Project through the Colorado River Storage Project Act. The Central Utah Project redirects and appropriates water that is within the state of Utah in tributaries that ultimately lead to the Colorado River, and it apportioned that water for use in Utah. The Central Utah Project has largely freed Utah from any water, from needing to collect water from outside state boundaries, water that originates outside state boundaries. In 1992, the federal government, Congress passed the Central Utah Project Completion Act, which shifted federal control of the Central Utah Project to management under the Central Utah Water Conservancy District. So I would defy anyone in this room to find a federally funded infrastructure project that has passed through Congress and then had a subsequent act of Congress shift it from federal control to state or local control. But that happened here. So now instead of Utah's water being decided in Washington, D.C., it's decided largely in the Central Utah Water Conservancy District in Provo, Utah. So the result of this has been Utah has largely freed itself from many of the issues surrounding other states in the Colorado River Basin. The Central Utah Project will probably be the last major water development project in Utah to be funded by the federal government. That's D. Larry Anderson from the Director of Utah Division of Water Resources. The Government Accountability Office has said that Utah is one of two states west of the Mississippi River that has neither statewide, regional, or local water shortages. So will that be enough? The reality is probably not. Bringing local agencies more into the decisions that dictate where water comes from will do a lot, but I'm skeptical if that will do everything. So we need to look beyond simply that, and to do that, I believe we need to look to the nation of Israel. I have here a picture of Moses striking the rock at Mount Horeb, and I think of that as kind of a metaphor for how Israel has handled its water policy, and that it has arguably done better at any other country in the world at bringing water to its people. And there are three primary things that Israel does that I believe that the states in the Colorado River Basin should consider. And I've listed them here in order of importance. And in the interest of time, I'm going to get into only desalination in further detail. But recycled water and drip irrigation are exactly what they sound like. But let's talk a little bit about desalination. This is the process by which salt and other minerals are removed from seawater. Israel has 5 major desalination plants along its coasts. All of them are privately owned and operated. The Israeli government simply purchases the water from them. So why doesn't California, for example, simply put a desalination plant along every major city? Now they do have the largest desalination plant in North America in Carlsbad, but that is largely all they have as far as major desalination plants go. Affordability and climate concerns are the two biggest when it comes to these desalination plants. Affordability, we've come a long way. 10 years ago, we couldn't reasonably have this discussion about desalination plants, but we can now because technology has brought us there. The climate concerns are still there. And I believe that there is a solution that has been met to assuage the serious climate concerns that certainly Californians have, but really we all should have. And that is through brackish water plants. Now, brackish water is seawater that is lower in salt content because it is near the mouth of a river. California has 3 major brackish water desalination plants. They bring water to 2.3 million Californians. Just these 3. They do have others. And I think it's important that we see this as a conservative victory because instead of California relying on water from Lake Mead, for example, which originates in the mountains of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, they are instead relying on water close to them. They have local agencies that are pulling water from the ocean, treating it, and then giving it to their citizens, rather than pulling water from Lake Mead, which isn't even as close to California as the ocean water is. And even that water in Lake Mead comes all the way from the Colorado mountains. So what about the dams? So there are 2, like I mentioned earlier, there are 2 major dams on the Colorado River, the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam. It's hard to argue against the hydroelectric capabilities of these dams. And it's also hard to argue when you consider how much water these dams are currently providing people in the Colorado River Basin. And so you won't see me out there protesting outside the Hoover Dams, chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, this dam's got to go." But I do think it's important that we see the reservoirs these dams create our goal should be to someday see these reservoirs as last resorts, not reliable primary sources, which is what particularly Lake Mead is now. And the reality is that when it comes to Las Vegas will be relying on Lake Mead water for a long time to come. And that's inevitable. I would say if I've convinced you to the point where you're ready to begin those protests, if you do the Glen Canyon Dam, because it's in Utah, it'd be better to say, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, this darn dam has got to go." My fellow Utahns will like that a lot more. So folks, I live in the West because I found the West to be a place that embodies freedom. And and personal responsibilities. My ancestors pulled handcarts across the country as LDS pioneers for religious freedom. And I found the West to be a place that embodies many conservative principles, and it's why it's a bastion of conservatism, with some obvious exceptions there. However, there is one area where this does not yet seem to be the case, and that is water. And I hope that today I've shared a few principles that can help the West better rely on its roots of freedom by creating agencies that are large enough to exercise political muscle in their state capitals and even in Washington, but small enough to where they understand the unique challenges of their area. I also hope that we can see state governments that are willing to bring water, to prioritize the local agencies when they have water that they need to allocate for their citizens. I also hope that when it comes to Washington, that we can, if we're going to fund any type of project, that we keep the management of these projects local, because they are going to know the needs best, and they're going to know where the water is as well. I think many of us should be familiar with this quote from William F. Buckley. I think it's one of his most well-known. And this is he wrote this in terms of political power. But I've paraphrased it here in terms of water, and I don't think it changes very much. When he says, this is a paraphrase again, I will not willingly cede more water to anyone, not to the state, not to the Bureau of Reclamation, not to the Department of the Interior. I will hoard my water like a miser, resisting every effort to drain it away from me. Thank you very much.
I was just wondering aloud if we could knock down the dams and have Mexico pay for the. Is there a way? I guess the question I have is really at the root of this. What's the specific proposal? And the other question after that, the follow-up is how would you propose achieving a balance between federal protections, because you could have states that could turn the water off for other states, and the states own autonomy to find solutions, which I agree, that are creative and local and better. So that's basically what's the essence of your proposal. I think you've laid out the problem brilliantly. I agree with you philosophically. Just if you could.
So the proposal is to encourage the creation of agencies that are large enough to exercise political power in state capitals and also possibly even to the Bureau of Reclamation itself, but small enough to understand unique challenges. These agencies don't exist all throughout the Colorado River Basin, nor do they exist all throughout the West. And where they do exist, sometimes they need to be made smaller, and sometimes they need to be made larger. And so I think that is the first step. And then once those agencies are created, that allows them to know the specific ideas for how they can obtain more water, like desalination, for example, like recycled water. The Southern Nevada Water Authority, for example, which supplies water for most of Las Vegas and the areas around it, they have ensued the recycled water idea, where they put their treated sewer wastewater back into Lake Mead and receive credits that they can pull more out. That's just one example of an agency just the right size to know how to provide water for people in that area.
Thank you.
So I have a question. So the states in most crisis in the Basin are California, Nevada, New Mexico, and they have Democratic political leadership. So my question is there a correlation between political party leadership in the relative success rates of these states in water conservation programs?
I would say that as far as I can tell, there is not necessarily a correlation. I think that, and one of the reasons I felt inspired, I guess, to write this and to present this on this is because I don't think that we're recognizing the good ideas as actual conservative ideas, even when Democrats are doing them. I mentioned the Brackish water plants in California. I mean, most of those are paid for. I mean, they're paid for by the government, and the government is led by Democratic politicians. But that doesn't make them any less conservative in my mind. So I would not necessarily say that there is a correlation between sound, even conservative water policy and the partisan leadership.
So how many of the states in the basin are actually implementing all three of these strategies which Israel has pioneered? How many have met with Israel actively to implement some of these methodologies?
That's a good question. I can say, so some of the like desalination, Utah, all the states really except California, desalination can't really do anything for them. But with that exception, I know California is actually really, the drought from 2012 to 2016 has really turned California on to this issue, and they are trying very hard to find good solutions, and they're finding good solutions. So I would say California definitely has. Nevada has as well, because Nevada has kind of been forced into it. Arizona and New Mexico are a little slower on that. And Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming have kind of a different set of problems because they largely supply the Colorado River. And their shortages, particularly Colorado and Wyoming, their shortages are coming because they're giving all this water away. And they're not as much as they would like is being left behind for them. So the solutions are different in every state. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
You talk about the, let's say, the interception of the locally sourced water in Utah, which is to say, rather than just depending on the river, we'll get the water before it gets there. It still seems like that creates the same kind of problem downstream. It's one of the few areas, it's hard for me to admit that the federal government has to do things, but certainly watching out to make sure that somebody doesn't steal all the water before it gets down to the next state is part of it. Isn't Utah, in a way, doing that by getting the water before it reaches the tributaries?
You mean like taking the water for itself? And
taking the water for itself, yeah.
Well, so I would say that I mean, yes, they are. What I would rather see, I would rather see that rather than have Utah rely on pulling water directly out of the Colorado River, because when the first priority, when you have a given river and the communities closest to it get what, again, the lawyers call first dibs, to me, that what has been demonstrated is that the communities downstream either have their own rivers or their own groundwater, and that those communities upstream are certainly not taking all of it. So what is happening, for example, in Colorado, Colorado is apportioned by the federal government an X number of acre feet a year. And what Colorado ranchers find is that if they don't use all of that, if they use less than X, then they're going to get that smaller number next year. So that they're incentivized to often use more water than they need. Rather, what I would prefer is let those states take what they need without telling them what they need. Okay. And I trust the ranchers of Colorado not to overflood their fields just because they want to have enough water next year. That they're just going to take what they need and let it go downstream, rather than putting a quota on how much they have to have. And if you take less than that, well, you're going to get that next year.
Are there fewer federal regulations on the tributaries than on the main rivers?
As far as I know, yes, but I'm not a lawyer. There are attorneys who this is their career, who would be better prepared to answer that. My guess would be yes.
Okay.
But there are.
At the risk of offending some people in the room, you mentioned that the Colorado River was the greatest river in the United States.
It's economically important.
If we're waiting for another one, tell me a little about the economics of this desalination. I mean, obviously you can do it, but it would be a lot more of it would be done if it weren't such an expensive way of creating water.
Right.
And certainly Israel is a unique situation where there's virtually no other source of water at all. California has competing sources of water.
Yes.
Is it something that is done by California out of desperation, or does it really, and it's heavily subsidized effectively, or is it really something that is sustainable economically?
I would say the answer is yes. It is. It's done out of desperation, but it is also done in part because it is subsidized. It is particularly these brackish water plants are seen as a solution to the climate concerns because they produce far less of the brine that the heavy brine that a major desalination plant would produce. But I would think that the desalination plants are, when they're constructed, just like I mentioned in Israel, they're all privately owned, privately operated, and that that definitely smells of subsidies because the opportunity for a business to raise the costs artificially or even lower it because they're getting subsidized. So I think that I'm not in favor of that, obviously, but I think that it ought to be approached in a way that shows that they're good for the environment. I mean, they're not as bad for the environment as a typical major plant would be put anywhere on the ocean, but and so we kind of need to meet the opposition in the middle and say, as long as we're not running something like a subsidy here, and this is clean, a solution can be met in constructing them.
Am I correct in understanding that Utah has greater autonomy than other states in the West? And how did that happen, if that's the case?
So partly the Central Utah Project freed them from that by relying on just tributaries rather than the main line of the Colorado River. They've also found a lot of success in groundwater, and I haven't really mentioned that very much because groundwater is
But why did the federal government give it back to Utah? Was that a pure political battle, and you had the juice to get it done?
As far as I know.
Okay.
Okay. I know Senator Hatch was a big part of that.
That makes sense. Okay, that's
Yeah.
right. Hatch is a lot of salmon.
Yes.
Policies. I'm wondering if the real problem here is we haven't let the market allocate water appropriately. In the U.S., if I'm not mistaken, and you're the expert on this, not me, I think water prices are about half to a third of what they are in Europe, and consumption per capita is over double. And we have some crazy policies. I don't know what it's like in Colorado and Utah, but like in California, the farmers get like 80% of the water. And so there's Mr. Market's not being allowed to allocate water on the basis of price. And I know in a lot of municipalities, water prices are regulated.
Yeah.
As consumers in this room, we probably don't want to hear this, but maybe the problem is we're not letting the market mechanism work, i.e. price should be allowed to allocate water. The price of water is too low, if you look at the U.S. Per capita consumption statistics, and it's government getting in the way of this whole thing, perhaps deregulating the whole water market. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with a lot of that we do need to have more of let the market have more influence. And I would actually say that more local organizations, more local agencies that set that price is more likely to happen. Again, my hometown just raised rates a few years ago, and the process was very democratic, and it was not very popular, but our agency demonstrated why it was necessary. And it ultimately passed because in spite of a lot of public pushback, and I think our agency did a very good job of presenting that in a way that ultimately made a lot of people more comfortable with that price. But I would, one thing I didn't really mention much in the presentation is the efforts to conserve water through laws like irrigation limits and campaigns to only flush your toilet once a day. And the reality is those things don't work very well. They just don't. Places that do that you don't see a very big difference in water consumption rates. And so, anyway, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned groundwater recently. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago about how private groundwater is getting contaminated and poisoned at a really high rate, mostly in the Midwest, but also in places like the Colorado Basin. Is that like a concern as you look forward? You know, something that I seem to take away from the presentations, we're pretty tight already, and that's something about like 26% of private water usage is groundwater. So how do you see those issues intersecting?
Well, I would once again go toward more local control of what protected sources of water, and that includes groundwater. Most places, I mentioned my home state of Utah a lot, and I've spoken about their surface water use. The reality is most water in Utah comes from groundwater. In fact, most water in the United States does come from groundwater. And so it's very important where that groundwater is pulled from, and there is a very large array of what types of places groundwater is taken from. And it really depends on who is protecting that area. So I would be more in favor of areas that had a little bit more hands-on control and were therefore more local to those areas. In my hometown, groundwater is taken from mostly federal lands, because most of Utah are federal lands, and that should be a little distressing to my neighbors, and I don't think it's a huge worry, huge concern of mine, but it certainly is, and so thank you.